On November 12, 1993, in Denver, Colorado, the first ever UFC event was held. This spectacle was a far cry from the UFC of today. There were very few rules, no weight classes, no decisions, and no time limits. 2 men enter, 1 man leaves. There were 8 competitors brave enough to answer the call to fight that night, including a 400-pound sumo wrestler, a 6'5" Dutch kickboxer, a juiced-up shoot fighter, and a professional boxer. All rough figures that you wouldn't want to meet in a dark alley. So the world was shocked when the winner of this tournament ended up being a nondescript Brazilian kid that weighed 180 pounds soaking wet and looked more like an accountant than a fighter. And not only did he win, but he ran through all of his opponents without taking a single punch. Now some of you may be wondering, what does any of this have to do with poker? Well, there are, in many ways, a number of parallels between the UFC and poker. In its earlier days, the UFC, like poker, was banned in virtually every state. It was largely shunned by polite society and viewed as a low-class activity filled with heathens. So how did the UFC go from being on the brink of bankruptcy to the huge multi-billion-dollar industry it is today? Well, they made a very deliberate effort to shift the public's perception of MMA away from no-holds-barred cockfighting and towards a competitive sport featuring skilled elite athletes, which brings us to the problem with Hustler Casino Live. Now, to be clear, what HCL has done in such a short amount of time is pretty spectacular. The show is professionally produced, their marketing is top-notch, and they've grown the game crossing many different boundaries. But just because something is good doesn't mean it's perfect and can't be improved. And one glaring issue that few seem willing to speak about is that they've obviously made a conscious decision to move their game away from a showcase of skilled players and towards the glorification of degenerate gambling. Case in point, HCL just wrapped up its most popular series ever in the $1 Million Buy-In event. These games brought massive hype and viewership, and I personally enjoyed most of it. But even though the games featured some of the most well-known high-stakes action players on the planet, the overall consensus has been that most of the participants, particularly in earlier games, played relatively tight. And who can blame them? No matter how much money you have, $1 million is no small sum. But if the most popular game you've ever run features stakes where if a player loses 1 or 2 buy-ins, it could be devastating for his livelihood, you are promoting degeneracy. If the biggest stars that you push, that you put up on massive billboards, casually and recklessly lose millions of dollars, you are promoting degeneracy. If participants are regularly chastised for playing within their means or playing conservatively, and conversely are praised as having heart and producing art when they punt, you are promoting degeneracy. And if you remove skilled players from the game, so that the main appeal is no longer watching the best compete, but rather to see people lose soul-crushing amounts of money, you are promoting degeneracy. Let's pause on this last point for a moment. The most watched series in modern poker history featured lineups where good players were intentionally removed. In fact, the most skilled player out of all the lineups was a semi-retired heads-up specialist who was likely only allowed to play because of his large following, and he ended up bringing the most action, resulting in the best game of the series by far, which I don't think was a coincidence. Think about it. In what other sport or competitive activity in the world is its pinnacle, its Super Bowl, embodied by mediocrity? I can't think of anything but poker and perhaps one other sport. There are no two ways about it. Hustler Casino Live, the biggest poker show on the planet, is deliberately moving the game of poker in the opposite direction that the UFC moved MMA to achieve mainstream popularity. And while the show is sure to grow in the short term, if HCL continues to focus on degeneracy as its main selling point, its growth and the growth of the game will inevitably be capped. The sobering reality is that there are huge swaths of the population that will always turn their nose up at the idea of gambling, including investors, sponsors, the general public, and regulators. So although 50,000 concurrent viewers is great, in my humble opinion, poker has the potential to be much, much more. Perhaps I'm being too ambitious, but I don't think we should be content with being relegated to our own little niche alongside mukbangs and girls in jacuzzis. And although I'm sure many will disagree with this criticism, The undeniable truth is that degeneracy in poker has destroyed countless lives. This is the dirty little secret that no one wants to talk about or deal with, because doing so goes against the self-interests of anyone that makes a living from this game. So does this mean that HCL should completely scrap its marketing strategy and try to turn itself into Triton? Well, not exactly. As we said earlier, what Nick and Ryan have done with the show is phenomenal, and they should capitalize on the momentum they've created. But this does not require embracing the gambling aspect alone and veering completely away from showcasing players with skill. Even in the UFC, there's a dichotomy of fans that watch the sport. On the one hand, the majority of fans are casual viewers who just want to see guys stand and bang.
Grab his dick and twist it!
But on the other hand, there are many other UFC fans who are essentially the equivalent of the GTO nerd. In MMA, they are known as jiu-jitsu nerds, the types who have fallen in love with the complexity and nuance of martial arts. And while they may not percentage-wise be the predominant demographic of the UFC, they are its base, the UFC's most die-hard fervent consumers, the ones that watch every UFC from start to finish. And although the blood and guts brawlers that bring the most action often end up being the fan favorites, they're usually relegated to the prelims, or at best, opening the main card. The fighters that the UFC showcases in the main event are almost always the absolute elite, the most skilled, most conditioned, and most prepared athletes that dedicate their entire lives to the game. And it is in those special moments where skill and action collide that the game is taken to the next level. Now, we would be remiss if we didn't recognize the fact that poker has a unique problem in that it can be hard to mix different types of players in the same game, as there are certain action players that will outright refuse to play with high-level pros. But everyone has a price, and there must be some point at which both Recs and pros would be willing to play against each other. Perhaps you could force the pros to VPIP at a certain percentage, or give them a 10-second shot clock, or make them straddle every hand or play out of position post-flop. There are countless different ways that pros could be handicapped to the point where the Recs will believe that they have a fair shot at making money in the game. And while some may argue that the general public is simply not familiar enough with the technicalities of poker in order to enjoy watching the top competitors play, the same was also true before UFC 1. But then along came a harmless-looking guy in pajamas that opened up the entire world's eyes to the skill and beauty that was possible with the game.